notes to review before we get started. Tonight's presentation is being recorded and will soon be available for on-demand viewing on the Alumni Association website. Our speakers are very eager to answer questions that you may have. And so you're welcome to submit the questions through the presentation using the Q&A box. You can find this box by hovering over your screen, locating the Zoom toolbar and selecting Q&A. So definitely, please put some questions in. It is my pleasure to virtually gather in conversation together with Josephine Halverson, Breehan James, and Marc Schepens, artists who are also incredible faculty members and colleagues in the painting area of the School of Visual Arts. This webinar, Slowing Down for Art, arose from conversations about painting and time, along with talks and essays by these colleagues that took place before the pandemic. A year into the pandemic, perhaps we are all thinking about how we experience time differently now. And I think we're all aware of missing the physical impact of art when so many museums are closed, though they're opening up. And also, just to say, the School of Visual Arts has mostly been open. Studios have been open. I feel that I've been so lucky to be surrounded by art in person all year. Many alumni have posted about the benefits of reconnecting with perceptual drawing practices. Each of tonight's presenting artists, Josephine Halverson, Breehan James, and Marc Schepens, have made work that calls attention to the pace of looking, marking a day's or an hour's time or the time of a forest. Looking at their works in person, one has a sense of the time spent making work through the material evidence of the working process, the marks, surface, and ground. As Halverson has noted in an article about the ground for Art in America, her paintings become a form of casting, a one-shot wet into wet impression of the day. Our first speaker tonight is Breehan James, Assistant Professor of Painting. Breehan James's paintings portray her experiences exploring the wild places of the North and the people connected to them. Her studio practice extends works made in the field to her studio in an effort to evoke these experiences and portray their substance. James draws influence from her Northern Midwestern upbringing, in addition to 19th century Nordic landscape painting and the American and Canadian artist adventurers. Breehan James was born and raised in the Fox River Valley, Wisconsin. She received her MFA from Yale University and a BFA from Massachusetts College of Art. She has had solo shows in New York City at Larissa Goldstein Gallery and in Milwaukee at Tony Fuller Gallery, as well as participating in many group shows in New York at Larissa Goldstein Gallery, Elizabeth Houston Gallery, and at Alderman exhibitions in Chicago, and galleries across the United States and Canada. Breehan was a 2014-15 recipient of the Sharp Lentis Space Program in Brooklyn and has participated in many residencies and fellowship programs, most notably at the National Museum of Art, Architecture and Design in Norway and the National Gallery of Canada. Breehan has been an artist in residence for Arts in the Park at Quetico Provincial Park, the Stowe School in England, and at the Vermont Studio Center. Breehan, the floor is yours. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Dana. Go to the next slide, please. So during the summer of 2006 is when I started to paint from life. I had just had a really rough year of grad school, my first year of grad school. And all I really knew is that I had a lot of painting problems. I left school for the summer and I escaped to my late grandfather's cottage in the north woods of Wisconsin. It felt so good to be there, to be home and to be in a place that was so familiar, yet had always sparked my imagination. I didn't feel like making paintings, but I had to keep painting. And I figured the best way to conquer some of these big painting problems I had was to paint from life. Next slide. Still to this day, I paint from life, but I'm also a studio painter. In the studio, I make oil paintings, and in the field, I make works on paper. This work on paper started with a drawing. I find the structure of the building first, and then I carefully added the tree trunks and the major branches and divisions. Then I paint from front to back, painting all the leaves and then filling in the ground, sky, and the cottage all around them. Next slide. If my larger works on paper take about 3 days to finish on site, the oil paintings are much slower. Often my oil paintings take a whole year to finish. The oil paintings use the work on paper as the primary source. Next slide. When my cottage became the subject of my paintings, I was interested in making a very faithful portrait of this place. It was sacred to me, and I wanted to include everything. The paintings became devotional in their labor and so slow. I think it's also worth mentioning that I felt quite embarrassed to be making these paintings as a young person. They seemed so traditional, and at the time I really had thought of myself as a kind of culture vulture and sort of tuned into contemporary art. And here I am making paintings of cottages in the woods. All I can say is that I felt compelled to make the work, even though I knew better. Next slide. When I thought about how to describe this cottage in a painting, it didn't take long for me to venture out to some of the surrounding lakes, rivers, and woods. I can't think of my experience at this cottage without including the woods around it. Next slide. After making landscapes about the places around my cottage, I began to think about all of the other wild places I had visited throughout my life, and I wanted to go back to some of these places to try and make paintings. For 10 consecutive summers, I painted out in the Boundary Waters while canoe camping. I would travel to the best lakes and rivers in this pristine wilderness park in northern Minnesota. Next slide. I love being outside, but painting outside just isn't fun. It's not fun to me. The mosquitoes buzzing in my ear, the wind flipping my paper into the water, the sun burning my eyes. It just all feels hard, intense, exhausting, and I just can't wait to get to the end of the painting. Even though it isn't fun, I know it's good for the painting. But what I do like about painting from life outside is that I never really know what it is that I'm going to paint that day. I know it when I see it, but that reveal is always thrilling. Next slide. During that decade-long run of summers in the Boundary Waters, I was living in New York. Spending those 3 to 4 weeks out in the wilderness was like pressing a reset button on my nervous system. Time in the wilderness sustains me, centers me, and makes my mind and body calm. Next slide. When I first started, I used to make Ziploc size paintings. These are 6 inches by 8 inches. But then I scaled up to make larger work contained in a 24 by 36 inch cardboard portfolio wrapped in garbage bags. Next slide. These trips have been a great way to generate work. I see something that interests me, I paint it, and I just ask questions later. There's no way to ever look at the work after making it. It's just immediately put away into my portfolio to be taken out weeks later in my studio. Next. Of course, at night, there's nothing to do but look at the stars and moon, to build a fire, to think, to reflect, to tell stories with people that I'm with. Next. I'm attracted to things that don't change much or change slowly, places I can visit and revisit again to find them almost the same. I hope the paintings honor and celebrate this uninterrupted place and time spent away from the habits of my busy and distracted everyday life. I use oil painting as a way to bring control back into the painting, to control subtle shifts in color and light, to articulate the personality of a specific tree. While the work from life is attempting to translate what I'm seeing, making the studio paintings feels like building that experience again, piece by piece. Next. 2 years ago, I started to work on a book of paintings about the cottage. I thought of the book as a farewell tour. I've made paintings of this cottage now for 15 years, and it's time to move on, I told myself, to zoom back out and not make work that is so personal. Next. I've always worked in series, the cottage paintings, deer hunting drawings and paintings, the Boundary Waters paintings. It seemed natural that a book would be an adequate form to contain a place. Next. The book consists of 26 paintings that move from the outside to the inside and outside again. Page breaks keep a rhythm of moving from room to room, point of view to object to landscape. Next. What has been most refreshing for me about the book form is thinking about how it can be shared, published or self-published, and perhaps it can reach a totally different audience compared to showing the paintings in the gallery. A book is affordable, intimate, economical. Next. Working on this project has helped me keep up the momentum in my studio practice during the busy academic year, finishing a page every 2 or 3 weeks. And next. When I finish the book this summer, I plan to make another book about the Boundary Waters and hope to keep up that momentum, which has also generated so many new ideas for paintings. Lastly, I just want to say it's a privilege to have time. It's such a privilege to be an artist and to look closely and to reflect. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Breehan. Our next speaker is Marc Schepens. Marc Schepens is a lecturer in art and painting and director of undergraduate studies. His paintings are made from daily rituals of waking, walking, and painting. These acts of repetition and routine are similar to the cycles of nature and the human experience of time. Marc echoes this experience in the pictorial structure of space, light, and the seascape. Marc is a BA from Georgetown University and is an alum of MFA Painting, Boston University, 2011. Recent solo exhibitions include East Point, Bromfield Gallery, Dog Paintings, Harvard University, Works on Paper, Harbor Gallery, University of Massachusetts, and EGM at Art Space Gallery, Northern Essex Community College. Marc has shown in the Area Code Art Fair, Music Collective, Abel Baker Contemporary, and at Alpha Gallery. He was a 2020 recipient of the Blanche Coleman Award. Thank you so much, Marc. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Dana, Josephine, and Breehan. It is a huge pleasure to be here and have this conversation with such special friends, colleagues, and artists. And thank you to the BU Alumni Association for this opportunity. Next slide, please. These are 2 blind contour drawings by students from Drawing 1 classes. We ask students to observe the subject, place their drawing tool on their paper, pick a place to start, and move their eyes across and around the contours of the subject as slowly as possible, having their drawing tool mimic the travels of their eyes. They do the drawing blindly, without looking at it. The emphasis is on the process of looking, not the outcome of the drawing. As a visual artist, we try to find ways to look carefully and critically at the world, at the things we make, and inside of ourselves. These blind contour drawings represent for me what, if we choose to be an artist, becomes an endless effort to try to step out of the way of ourselves, question notions of likeness, and what it means to try and see. Next slide, please. This image is an image looking east to the Atlantic from the easternmost point of the town where I live, called Nahant, about 15 miles north of Boston. About 3 years ago, my family got a dog. It was the archetypal or sort of classic story of me, the father, doing everything possible to prevent the addition to our family, and my wife and children insisting and ultimately winning out. I will spare you the details. But the dog, named Blue, elicited a change in my life: walking. What began as a chore became a part of my studio practice as a painter. I have found walking to be a natural accompaniment to creativity. It is an antidote to speed and doing everything in a precipitous manner. Walking facilitates the unspoken dialogue of thinking. I found my perceptions and awareness of my surroundings changed and altered with the shift away from the normal pace and routine. Walking, like drawing blindly, has helped me break down certain filters and allow me to see my environment and the ocean in a different way through painting. Next slide, please. Here's a work in progress. The influence of routine and repetition began to play a key role in my painting practice, and the way I not only organize my studio day in terms of walk, studio, walk, but the way I paint, repeating lines, marks, and colors. Next slide, please. This is Untitled, December 12th, 2020, 60 by 48. I have found that walking and the practice of repetition in painting give me the sense that time expands, or at least its passage slows. And I suppose at the very least, my experience of time changes. In my work, I have found that my experience of the ocean mines the sort of permeable space between representation and abstraction. I'm not trying to make a picture of the ocean, but more so evoke its presence, its phenomenal presence, that I have become more aware of. Next slide, please. Untitled, February 6, 2021, 48 by 46, sort of winter painting. At the end of the day, it is important to recognize that the paintings are a sort of metaphor for the presence of the ocean. They cannot compare to the real thing. I am interested in the light on the water, the movement of the water, the sense of space one gets when they look at the ocean. It is seemingly endless, and yet at the same time, we know it is not. Next slide, please. This is Untitled, January 7th, 2021, 48 by 46. I am interested in and recognize the relationship of the work to the innumerable traditions of pattern and decoration that extend back in time to our ancestors' earliest visual impulses and across all time and cultures afterwards. I am especially interested in those that relate to that space between representation and abstraction. Patterns can symbolically represent many things: people, beliefs, history, tradition, identity, and the natural world. A brief and very incomplete list would include figural-based secular Islamic traditions, work by the indigenous people of Australia, and Ghanaian kente cloth. Next slide, please. This is Untitled, December 29th, 2020, 41 by 39. These paintings are not spiritual or mystical. They are me, trying to figure out what is going on in the world around me. They relate to histories of landscape painting, like the Belgian artist Ilse Dollander. They relate to histories of modernist abstraction, like artists like Nasreen Mohammadi and Agnes Martin. And they relate to the aforementioned histories of pattern and decoration. Next slide, please. This is Untitled, February 28th, 2021, 11 by 16. My father used to grapple with his efforts to make sense of existence using Cartesian theory. I think, therefore I am. I like to think, but I'm aware that I ultimately fall short, that my paintings are a metaphor or evocation of a sort of pre-Cartesian blip. And they ask me, what do I perceive before I think? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marc. Our next presenter is Josephine Halverson. Josephine is the professor of art and chair of graduate studies in painting. Josephine makes art that foregrounds firsthand experience and takes the form of painting, sculpture, and printmaking. Born in Brewster, Massachusetts, she studied at the Cooper Union, Yale Norfolk, and Columbia University. She is the recipient of major international residencies and fellowships, including a 2021 Guggenheim Fellowship, the US Fulbright to Vienna, Austria, the Harriet Hale Woolley at the Fondation des États-Unis in Paris, France, and at the French Academy in Rome at the Villa Medici. Her work has been exhibited internationally and is represented by Sycamore Jenkinson Co., New York, and Peter Freeman, Paris. Selected exhibitions include SECA, Storm King Art Center, the ICA Boston Foster Prize exhibition as part of the Havana Biennale in 2019. Later this year, she will present a solo exhibition at the Georgia O'Keeffe Museum in Santa Fe, New Mexico, where she was an artist in residence. Halverson's work and practice have been written about extensively, and she is a subject of Art 21's documentary series, New York Close Up. Thank you so much, Josephine. The floor is yours.
Thanks, Dana. And thanks so much for bringing us together, Breehan and Marc. And I teach together and work together, but we rarely talk about our work together. So this is a really, really joyous occasion actually to share ideas, and much of what Breehan and Marc have already shared tonight is reflected in my own practice as well. So it's a pleasure and privilege to be here, and thanks to everyone who's tuning in. So I am also a painter primarily, and if you were to Google images of my work, it would look roughly like this. They are paintings usually of objects and surfaces, most of which appear somewhat old or have some kind of history embodied by their materiality. This is a screenshot of some images that I take of my practice when I'm working. Like Breehan, I work from life. But for me, I am interested in materializing the experience of being in a place over the period of a certain amount of time. For me, I've asked questions about the sketch as it relates to the finished painting, and how experience in all of its forms, that can be sensual, atmospheric, conversational, cultural, can be embodied by an object. My work has taken place in many different locations. For about a decade, I made paintings on the go. I didn't really have a home base as such, although I was, I would come back to New York to show my work. And if I taught for a semester somewhere, I would travel there and make work, or if I had friends, I would stay with them. And it was a practice that was made on the road, making paintings, not unlike photography, where I looked at things and simply made paintings of them. When I first started this practice, I did not want to plan what it was that I was painting. I wanted to find out what my interests were through looking. And I think on the topic of today, with slow looking and kind of slowing down for art, I would say that painting has its own kind of pace, its own agenda in a way, materially, and it has a lot to say even before I get involved in it. It has so many histories, so many different kind of materialities, etc. So for me, it was important that I kind of yield to that experience and see what the result was. This practice taught me a lot about the world. I would meet people I otherwise wouldn't meet, have conversations with people I otherwise perhaps wouldn't have conversations with. It became a practice of looking at things, but also being looked at. It's a public way of working. And in that sense, the painting takes place in public. So as I was going about this practice, and which came to be reliable for me, my methodology didn't change that much. It was something I could do on my own, set up an easel, make a painting then and there, and see what came of it. It was a practice that really taught me a lot about the world, and I'm very grateful for it. I started to learn what my interests were, and they were not that maybe that interesting, but to me they were, faces and things, traces, histories, industry, the environment. They are interesting, but I didn't go into my paintings with that as an intention. So I would say that this kind of regular aspect of looking, I really related to what Marc was saying about walking and the kind of routine of it. Through that regularity and through that regular looking, I started to become familiar with what it was that motivated me as an artist, what I was drawn to, and the painting showed me that. Whatever I was going through in my life, it had a way of kind of mirroring that back to me, my own relationship to my health, to family relationships, what was happening in the world around me. And in that sense, this kind of looking started to be about something more than what it appeared to be. So looking at something very closely, even if it was extremely literal, I started to learn about something that was more than met my eye. And I'm not sure if those lessons, I guess, through painting are communicable outwards, but to me, it was the only way I could access deeper sensations, things you can feel but you can't quite see, that are invisible, like time, history, emotion, psychology, weather. These were, I started to become more interested in the less visible but nonetheless felt aspects of being in a body, in a place and time. These are paintings that I made in Rome of the same window, and I painted them over the course of a night each. Duration and time became very important. What is my aptitude for seeing, for looking? What can I see? What can't I see? Sometimes I would forget to paint something that was right in front of me. And then I would remember it in the next painting. I thought with each of these that I was describing precisely what I saw. But in fact, what was changing was me. So the subject didn't change, the materials or methodology didn't. What changed was my own perception. So for me, this practice became one of probing what is visible and what isn't, what changes and what doesn't. It also is a practice of trespass, by and large. As I mentioned, I was always kind of making paintings on the road. When I moved to Massachusetts, or back to Massachusetts 5 years ago, to actually a year after which I took the job at Boston University, this is, I started to get in touch with the land around me. Walking, this was an exhibition called As I Went Walking, and I started to notice these traces of ownership of the land. This was also the beginning of the Trump presidency, thinking about borders and citizenship, belonging. It was the first time I ever owned property or a home. So what that felt like was something I was exploring through looking, just through being in a place. Before I even painted, just simply by standing on the ground or looking at something, I had a subject position. That led me to paintings of the ground, and my work changed materially. Hard to tell in this image, but it's a painting which has a surround, which includes parts of the ground where I was working that were kind of crushed into the surface. Here's a detail of that as well. And the more I looked at the ground, the more I saw, and the more it transformed into something else. I was stunned by the literal nature of what was right in front of me, which became actually something kind of galactic, or just totally otherworldly. So for me, this practice of looking has been so generative, and I certainly have seen more than has met my eye. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Everyone can go ahead and turn on your cameras. We'll start our conversation. I really thank you so much for those really amazing presentations. There are just so many different threads between all of you that I look forward to talking with you about. And I want to just see, I don't think I've seen anything in the Q&A yet. For me, there are a couple of specific things on my mind for each of you, but generally that sense of recognition, I think, is really interesting, that by repeating something, whether it's, all of what we do as painters, right, is repeated many times, but also just specific forms of ritual and repetition that each of you have. Josephine, you really spoke to that sense of I feel like recognizing something in the work. So I just wonder if each of you could speak a little bit more about how through time, over time, as painters who've worked for a long time in your fields, that form of recognition has evolved, or anything else about ritual and how you use ritual in your work. Breehan, I'm going to call on you just to make it easy.
Okay. Well, yeah, it happened sort of by accident, but yeah, I just started kind of work seasonally, right? So I would go to the Boundary Waters every summer and make Boundary Waters paintings. I would go to my cottage in like the spring or maybe like the end of the summer to make cottage paintings. And then in the fall, I would make my I would go deer hunting and make drawings of deer hunters and paintings. And so, yeah, it kind of went with the seasons. And then my studio paintings happened in the winter.
Well, that's really interesting. So that sense of seasonality, we can see that in your work. Marc, is there anything on your mind about that? You spoke so much about it with walking.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the notion of repetition has played a very sort of uninspired practical role in my practice, in the sense that having, essentially working two jobs where we're teaching and then we're trying to be artists as well. We have sort of broken studio schedules, and I find it very difficult to, when I have an opportunity to go to the studio, to sort of be inspired. And so in many ways, like, I feel like my painting practice has been set up around a system that allows me to, I don't have to be inspired when I go to the studio, but I sort of know what I have to do. And through that act of repetition, I sort of, I learn more about what my interests are, where process can lead me, so on and so forth. So I know it's not a very exciting answer, but I mean, in many ways, it's just sort of practical, thinking about like how to structure one's life to feel like they're creative and engaged as an artist when they're also balancing all the other exigencies of having a broken schedule.
And that, I really appreciate that. I remember talking with you in August, I feel like it was August of 2019 or something, just standing there in the studio before the onslaught of the semester and talking about the work that you were making in the embossing in the print studio, and just like, knowing how long it would take to make a line. And so that sense of like, knowing what you can do in that time and not waiting for inspiration to strike, but making the process a whole cloth part of your life. I think that's the maturity of an artist, and also the reality of teaching. And Josephine, you've certainly spent a lot of time teaching as chair of graduate painting. So I'm curious about your own rituals.
Yeah, well, I was thinking about, did you mention recognition in your question?
It seems like through ritual, suddenly we recognize things and we don't have to force them.
Yeah, I was thinking about your question more in relation to recognition and to like see something again, the cognition aspect of it, and thinking about painting as I always think about painting as a site for coincidence, things coinciding, time, material, subjectivity, place, culture, and the way that they coincide, there is a kind of chance element. Breehan, I really liked how you mentioned that about kind of not quite knowing what was going to happen that day. And I think when you then look at the painting after the fact, there is this moment of recognition that has something to say back. And it's, and that's a very powerful, experience. It can also be very disappointing. But I think that the only way that can really, at least in my experience, can come about is through just doing it, day after day, time after time, and seeing what rises to the surface.
And that's something I remember from your talk when you first came to BU, is talking about the way a painting is an embodiment, looks back at you. You talked about kind of finding eyes in the things that you're painting, but also that accrual that happens over time that gives it an embodiment to look back, I think is especially exciting and interesting to think about. We actually have some questions, so it's fun to kind of go to the audience questions. Thank you all for putting some in the chat. Here's a question. Thank you for putting this together. And to all presenters, it's always great to see, to hear and see how you speak about your practices. I'm curious if you'd be willing to speak to if and how your studio practices relationship to time have changed over the course of the last year. So I think that's a great question. How is time changing for you now, or your studio practices changing now? If someone wants to take that first.
I'll go, I guess. Silences make me uncomfortable. I think I feel a little guilty answering this question in the sense that so many people have suffered loss and suffered had major impacts on their lives due to the pandemic. And for me, like, and my family, we've been very fortunate. And in a strange way, because of the fact that our jobs have changed, we don't have to come to work as often. I don't spend as much time in the car. I spend a lot more time at home, and I was really able to spend a great deal more time in the studio than I have years past. And so in many ways, I feel like my practice has become much more concentrated, much more focused, much more intense. And so again, I feel guilty saying this, but I feel like I've benefited in a way from in a strange way, I've personally benefited in a way from the change in which the ways we work and we live our lives. And I'll leave that there.
Thank you. I feel like we could, because we have a lot of questions here, maybe what I'll do is I'll rotate some because we have a couple of specific ones for specific people. Breehan and Josephine, do you feel that there is a political component to slow looking and observational painting?
I definitely do. I mean, I think that it's, as I mentioned before, the kind of public nature of working from life. I mean, I think there's a way in which that is performative. I'm being seen and encountered as much as I'm looking and encountering. So there is a social aspect to that. Sometimes, where I have worked has been very remote, but other times it's been in among other people. And actually, maybe I can tie this into the last question, which is my most recent work. I've made paintings at at my town's general store. I live in Western Massachusetts, and through the election season and the pandemic, I was just going down there and at a kind of safe distance in the back room was making paintings and more or less, just listening in on conversations that people from my town were having. And I still don't really know if any of the work is any good, but it was a way to, painting is can be a really good pretext to get involved in the world. And as I mentioned earlier, to learn. And I think that is certainly the case with my practice. And in that sense, there is a politics to it. There's a way of being among other people and being, and having my own kind of subject position and my own body in a space, be included in part of the practice.
Makes sense.
I also like the way that people think they know what is on my mind when they look at my painting, because it is what I'm looking at, but it's also all the other atmospherics that are around me. I think there's a whole other component of the kind of answer to this question, which maybe has to do with technology or a certain use of time, a kind of resistance towards productivity, or in a way that asserts its own kind of politics to it. But maybe Breehan, if you have.
Yeah, I guess I don't see anyone when I'm painting in the wilderness, except for the people that I'm with, or I'll see someone far away canoeing to another lake. But I think it's just the act of disconnecting. I mean, there's no cell phone reception, so it's like you leave it all behind. All your technology is left behind, and if I go out for a week or 2 weeks or 3 weeks, I totally have no clue with what's going on in the world. And I don't know if that's political, but I think it feels so different, right? Like I think I said in my talk a little bit, it felt like I was really pressing the reset button on my nervous system. It really feels it sparks my imagination to be in a kind of space like that, and to be sort of disconnected from that, just the habits of my everyday life, and just like emails coming in, like content coming at me. It just feels very calming to be in that kind of space. And of course, also to kind of paint in a protected wilderness.
I mean, just to put a plug in for your summer class called Drawing Trees, that you're teaching, but also I feel like in that class you have the social and scientific component. So whether it's political or more kind of social scientific, and like having you think like much more broadly, it seems like that's something that you're delving into more deeply as part of your art research at BU, and you know, the work that you're doing in the studio as well. So
thank you. Thanks
come
for
take a class with Breehan, summer
thanks for
term.
my drawing trees plug.
2021. We have a couple of, I mean, I'm going to read two questions, and if it seems too much, I'll go back and repeat them, because they're both for you, Josephine, and they both relate to the window series, and I think some responses to those. The first one, Josephine's paintings of the window in Rome provided such a beautiful meditation on consciousness. I love what she said about herself changing and thus her perceptions changing. Did those works change your approach or understanding of your painting practice after that? And then I'll follow it with that, because I feel like it's kind of similar. Hi, Josephine, you mentioned how your series of window paintings, the subject, materials, and methodology remain the same, but the change was in you and your perception. Could you talk about how your mark making relates to your perception? Does it feel controlled or subject to an intuitive subconscious response? So I feel like people were really captivated by that.
I mean, I think those paintings might have been the best work I've ever made, and as soon as I finished them, I felt like I had done everything I knew how to do, and have spent the last 5 years making pretty experimental work. I made monumental sculptures and printmaking editions, and changed the materiality of my work, built a house. You know, I was like, really have done a lot of new things since those paintings, because those paintings really brought a way of working to a close. So yes, it did. Those paintings did change my understanding of my practice after that. And that was for a number of reasons. When I made them, I was living in Ang's studio at the French Academy, you know, really steeped in a particular tradition of European painting. And I was, you know, the question of what to kind of bring to painting after where I was and the histories that I was so in such proximity to, I had a hard time kind of visualizing what I could do, what I could add after those. And it was actually a very difficult time. I felt like they encapsulated a lot of what I was going for a long time. So where do you go from there? And I'm really grateful that I brought that way of working to fruition, and then the last several years have been experimental. And Boston University has given me the opportunity to do that. Having a studio there, which is really like the first studio I've ever had, having the kind of support and stability has allowed me to take risks that, you know, have been very meaningful. In terms of the mark making and the kind of relationship to perception, one thing that was interesting with those is I remember thinking I felt like I was, because there were all of these concentric frames, I was, as I was painting them, I would make these marks, and then I kind of felt like my own gestures were like the hands of a clock ticking around the surface. And I was really painting time. And this is what I mean when I say brought those works really brought to fruition my interest, because I felt like I was in time in this way that was so meaningful. And when the dawn happened, the painting was done. And it was, I've never felt, I mean, maybe that was a certain kind of like mechanization of my own perception, but in that I was kind of becoming a clock. But and they also look like my eyes, which someone pointed out to me like a year later. They're like exactly the color of my own eyes. So they had all kinds of relationships, perception, and their materiality, their duration, that really got channeled through my hand.
Somehow I just had a vision of those hands in caves or something, you know, just that like making something come alive just through that mark and that repetition and that time. Kind of, I guess, related, well, not really related to that, but I think there's a question I'd like to ask Marc that's come up to start with, of like, how much time do you spend looking versus time painting? Do you feel the practice of looking is a constant? And I guess I wonder if you could talk more about kind of looking during your walks and like how you take that back with you.
I mean, I don't know that I can really sort of work out the sort of the mathematical relationship of the amount of time spent looking as opposed to painting, but I think that as artists, we spend all of our time really looking, and it's not just at our own work, but as teachers looking at the work of others, looking at the work of our students, looking at the work of our colleagues, looking at the world around us. So I feel like the act of looking is a sort of all-consuming, is an all-consuming part of our lives. And in terms of, time, it doesn't come down to very exciting things. It comes down to, the way the week works out and that sort of thing. But the routine, I guess, is pretty established, sort of a 3-mile walk first thing in the morning, and then try to get as much time in the studio as possible. And then whether it's, 6 hours, 8 hours, 3 hours, and then the walk afterwards to sort of just to allow for sort of, I guess, some sort of reflection, if you will. I find it so difficult to solve problems, formal problems in the studio sitting in front of a painting. And I find it so much easier to have time and space away from it to sort of reflect on things with a little bit of objective distance from it. So that's my answer.
I think there have been studies about that, right? Like if you have a problem and you need to solve it, that taking a walk, that going away from that problem is actually a really good way to do it, and kind of integrating that in the studio practice is interesting. And I feel like a couple of these questions they're from painters, because we know who some of these people are, asking questions that are about kind of like how you solve certain things. So one of them, Breehan, mentioned at one point, recognizing when it was time to move on from one subject or body of work to something else. I'm curious to hear from any of you, how do you give yourself permission to move on from a project, idea, or structure in your work that you've grown attached to, or perhaps make room for another focus? What does this transition feel like or look like? So if someone wants to take that. Breehan, maybe because, it was directed to you first.
Yeah, I mean, it feels pretty bad usually. I mean, like I'm just sort of thinking when my work changed the most, and that was in grad school, and I was just sort of really forced to make a change. And yeah, it was just such a hard time. I didn't know what to make paintings about anymore. Like I really hit a dead end. And then, I mean, the only thing that kept me going was just start painting from life and to just keep making work. And I had no idea if it was going to turn into anything decent, and who knows if it still is. I don't know. But I think just kind of like really trudging forward. But I think, I'm still like really want to sort of I made that book wanting to, as a kind of farewell tour to like the cottage, and really wanting to kind of move on, like be done. It seemed like it was a project that was just too personal, and wanting to zoom back out. But of course, like making that book, now I have all these different ideas that I'm really excited about. So yeah, I don't know how to move on, I guess.
It seems like you're intersecting different practices together, like going back to the woods this summer again, but still working on your cottage book, and going back to being a faculty member, and like trying to, the cottage book just seems so brilliant to me. I was like, great, perfect, do a book. You really fit that in with teaching. Another question that came up that, maybe intersects a little bit is, Breehan, Marc, and Josephine, can you talk about the emotions that come up when working slowly? Breehan, you mentioned working on site can be not fun. How do you and others find joy in the work? And how do you address patience and or frustrations or being bored? And I'm actually going to add another question to this, because another person asked, do you ever does fear ever enter into your paintings on site? So this kind of the emotions of working slowly, but maybe also the emotions of working on site? Seem like those two questions intersect.
That's a great question. And I want to know from Josephine, because I mean, her paintings are so intense, and just thinking about that window series and finishing that painting in a night, I want to know how it feels how it feels to make that painting.
Well, I think it feels a lot like photography, like a long exposure. And when I was in art school, I had some idea that paintings had to be worked over and labor had to be kind of evidenced on the surface. And I tried for years to try to make a painting that looked like that had that. And I remember in graduate school, Breehan, you mentioned graduate school, and one of my challenges there was I had this idea of what I should be doing, and it was probably because of some teacher in undergrad. At any rate, I made a painting where I had like 7 layers on the painting. And the 7th layer, I covered everything beneath it. And I was like, why have I been doing this? And I think that, for me, there's a kind of relationship to materiality, and, that's, or something that's central to my work, which, as I mentioned in my brief talk, which has to do with how experience can get translated and described as probably an empathic gesture, perhaps, or an interest in sharing something, an experience, but also in an abstract way, because I don't really believe in the narrative potential, at least for myself, about communicating what experience is like. There's something that has to do with embodiment that can really do that. And so I guess this kind of, that almost decade of like day paintings it was about what can the day capture. And Dana, you had made this quote at the beginning about a kind of cast of the day, or an impression of the day. And it did feel like casting in that way, where I was, it was wet until it wasn't anymore. And anything that happened in that time, anything that happened during that exposure was relevant to the painting. And that was all my decisions that were evidenced on the surface. It was, the frustrations and, difficulties that happened because of the logistics of working. I mean, rarely would I give up, but sometimes I would. Sometimes I would not be allowed access to a place, or, someone brought up the question of fear. I mean, in that way of working from life, you're so alert and so tuned into the environment around you, witnessing so much in the periphery. I almost feel the opposite of fear. Like I can notice everything. I feel very alive, and that vitality really carries me forward. But I'm not sure I could do it in some kind of athletic endurance kind of way beyond the this kind of container of time, this duration from sunrise to sunset.
I think that's really beautiful. Just thinking about duration and how that functions in the work. I want to ask a couple of, the kind of complex times we live in. There are a couple of questions around that. We are at about 5 more minutes, so it seems a little heavy to ask these questions, but I think it's important that they're coming up. One of them is, it would be unusual for the average person or an artist who works in a job that is not related to or supportive of their studio practice to be able to disengage from life or obligations to look slowly at anything. Do you reflect on the privilege of being able to disengage from life and spend time connecting with yourself and your practice? How does one balance the recognition of that internal external conflict as a person in a capitalist society trying to do something intellectual, academic, and explorative? So, I think, Marc, in some ways you took that on, because we do have quite full-time jobs during the year. We do, we have time during summer.
I mean, maybe that's where the fear comes in, to a certain extent. It is a tremendous privilege to be an artist and to be a teacher. It's a tremendous privilege to have time and space to reflect on what we do, and to be able to talk about the things we talk about. And in many ways, it feels quite selfish sometimes. It feels selfish in a microcosmic way, certainly when I reflect on my family and the time I've spent away from my kids. And not to become too anecdotal, but if teaching doesn't happen on weekends, then I don't go to soccer games and I paint. And in a larger sense, it feels, it can feel very complicated and potentially irresponsible in terms of thinking about how I'm supposed to play some sort of, how I feel I'm supposed to play some sort of greater role in society. And I'm not sure that my work can always answer to those questions. I feel like the bigger questions in terms of thinking about social issues and politics, I feel like in many ways, I engage with those more complicated, more urgent issues through teaching and through my efforts to, in terms of outreach through teaching. And I'm not sure that my work always does speak to those, to responsibility. And to, there's a question about decolonization in there. That fills me with insecurity. It fills me with fear to a certain way, but I've also committed to have a certain responsibility to my practice as well. And I'm 43 years old. I'm not going to step away from that now.
That sense of paying close attention, I mean, that practice has a place in, I mean, you know, not to end in 1 minute, you know, with political answers, but it does feel like at a time where things are quite divided into different categories, right? That it does feel like having nuance and complexity seems really important. You know, at least I feel that in teaching. And I think that, you know, that kind of role going back and forth between one's individual practice and the teaching practice, you know, we do think about that a lot. So thank you for that answer. And thank you for all of your answers. I don't, you know, I don't want to try to wrap this up. I'd love to continue the conversation another time. I just really appreciate the time that you've given to talk about your work and to give us just a kind of a corner of the way that you're thinking. And I just want to really thank everybody for coming out tonight and for many of our alumni who are on this call and making some comments as well. So thank you all. Thank you to BO Alumni Association.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks. Bye.